Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I hope everyone's doing great tonight. I was playing that music and allowing people to come into the live stream. We'll still wait a few more moments. But while I do that, I'll introduce the bookstore as well as myself. My name is Michaela. I'm the events coordinator for Sankofa Video on Books. We are a Black owned bookstore that's right across the street from Howard University. And we were founded by a filmmaking couple, Haile and Shurikiana Garima, most known for their film Sankofa, which can be live streamed on Netflix right now. And we're a bookstore that specializes in selling books that are by and about people of African descent. And we boast of the largest children's books in the DMV area that is solely dedicated to books that look like people like me and probably like you. So tonight we're so happy to have you. Happy Black History Month. We are hosting Professor Grieser for her book, The Black Side of the River, Race, Language, and Belonging in Washington, D.C., which draws on 10 years of interviews with dozens of residents of Anacostia, a historically Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., to explore ideas of identity, race, place, and more through the lens of language. Just, Jessica Grieser is an assistant professor of rhetoric, writing, and linguistics at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So I hope she'll forgive me for any butchering of these words that I'm about to say. She is a sociolinguist who specializes in discourse analysis, geosemiotics, and sociophonetics. And later she'll be joined by fellow linguist Minnie Anon. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Grieser.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I am so thrilled to be here. This book is about Blackness. This book is about Black history. This book is about about Black DC. It's about all the ways that we think about and we do race, and particularly how we do race in an important place. So, Michaela gave a little bit of an introduction to what the book is about and where it draws on. And I'm going to just really briefly explain where this work came from. And then in a few minutes, I will also have my discussion partner, Minnie Anon, who's another graduate student from Georgetown, come and join us for further conversation. So this project really has its roots in the year 2011. I was a graduate student at Georgetown University, go Hoya Saxa, and I chose Georgetown and I chose DC because of the incredible Black history that DC has. I've always been interested in urban space. I've always been interested in urban community. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which I now feel is too small of a city. And so I wanted a larger city, and I really wanted a city with the kind of rich Black culture that DC had. And I wasn't really sure what it was I was going to do with that information, but I did. I knew that this was something that I wanted to be a part of my graduate work and that I wanted to be able to think about as I was thinking about the role of language. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of linguistics, so linguistics really broadly is the study of language as the object of study. So often linguists say, like, we study language the way a biologist studies life rather than the way like a doctor studies the body. And so we're interested in language, not necessarily like language learning or language teaching. And, some of us work on our own language. I work on the language variety called African American language, which consists of all of the different ways that African Americans in the United States and elsewhere, sometimes we call it Black language, to acknowledge the ways that there are ways of being Black that often transcend linguistic boundaries. And so, for example, if you are Black Dominican, there's ways of being a member of the Black language community. And so, the Black side of the is really fundamentally about this role of language in creating Black community. And I got very interested in the early 2010s in the neighborhood of historic Anacostia in Southeast, and also in Southeast more broadly. So, feel free to pop in the chat if you want to give a what to Southeast, and or to all of Black DC. And I got very interested in the neighborhood because there was a class change that was happening in that neighborhood. Southeast was starting to receive an influx of people.
Oh, it looked like you got muted there.
Did I? Hey, there we go.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all. One would think. Why am I losing my mic? Ta-da. Let's see. Michaela, can we get a hey sign on the mic? Um, or if someone can pop that in the chat if for some reason you can't hear me. So early 2010s, uh, Southeast DC is experiencing an influx of people of different socioeconomic classes. And what was really fascinating about this was that it was largely happening in the absence of white people. So gentrification was happening in terms of the change in class, but it wasn't really happening in terms of a change of race, which is often how we think about and how we talk about gentrification. And at the time, I was a little graduate student and I'm trying to do my little studies. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to go interview people and I'm going to listen to like the individual things that they say and the sounds that they do. Um, and 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 I thought, okay, I'm really interested in these questions of what does it sound like to be Black and middle class, and I have answers to that, and I've published some really dense academic articles about that stuff. But what I discovered was that was not what mattered, and what actually mattered to the people in Anacostia was the neighborhood itself and what it meant to be a person from the neighborhood, what it meant to be a Black person from the neighborhood, what it meant to be a Black Washingtonian in a time that Washington was undergoing so much change. So for the next 10 years, on and off, I was interviewing and re-interviewing. I interviewed over 50 people, of whom 34 are included in the book. Residents ranging in age from 18 years to some number over 90 that my interviewee wouldn't quite tell me. But we had a wonderful conversation, and then she invited me in and cooked me turkey casserole, and it was absolutely outstanding. Um, and so I got all ages, I got all socioeconomic statuses, I got some people who had moved in as adults, I had some people who were third and fourth generation Anacostians, and really got a sense for the ways that the people talk about the neighborhood help make that neighborhood Black space. And so that's why the book is titled The Black Side of the River, and that's why the subtitle is Race, Language, and Belonging. It's about the different ways that people use language to instantiate themselves as Black Washingtonians from east of the river. And so I want to read a section of this is from chapter 1. And in chapter 1, I talk about some of the ways that people racialize the changes that are happening. And so, again, for context, very little racial change was happening in the neighborhood at the beginning of my data collection. That was in 2011, 2012. And at that time, most of the people who were moving into Southeast were still Black Washingtonians, sometimes Black residents of PG County who were coming back in. And, but at that time, what I discovered was that the narrative that gentrification is about race was still very prevalent, and people had lots of ways of talking about the whiteness in the neighborhood, even though the actual number of white peoples were very, very small. Like, we're talking dozens of residents moving in. So comes from chapter 1, The Discursive Erasure of White People from Gentrification, 3 Frames for the White Offensive. There are certain parts of DC you used to go and you never, a bit of nervous laughter, you only saw Black people. Tracy, a young advisory neighborhood commissioner, tells me as we sit across from each other in Anacostia's first coffee shop, located in the Anacostia Arts Center. Each ward of Washington, D.C. is broken into 40 advisory neighborhood commissions, ANCs, which were established as part of the D.C. Home Rule Charter. The resident neighbors elect their ANC commissioners who serve 2-year terms as the neighborhood's official voice in DC's city governmental structure. Now, you go to these areas and you're like, I don't see any black people. Like, wow, that's crazy. Like, I remember when you came here and you only saw X people. Now you come here and you're like, well, where is like, okay? So it has to be drastic for natives. Tracy is a relative newcomer to Washington, D.C. Having finished her undergraduate degree in education in the South, she moved to Washington to work in the public schools. After spending several years teaching, she left for nonprofit work and then moved on to the hyperlocal politics of the ANC. Even as she talks about the locals, she casts the changes in the wider Washington area in terms of race, places where one doesn't see any black people anymore. The talk about white people takes a variety of forms, from wonder at the influx of white people to an attitude of welcome for new racial diversity, for thinly veiled and sometimes not so thinly veiled derision. Each of these represents a different frame or interpretive schema through which the presence of whites in Anacostia is viewed, and which is evidenced in the ways a given speaker talks about the phenomenon. While most interviewees stuck to a single frame in their discussion of whiteness, a few used several, and these took 3 general valences: white residents as a neutral novelty, white residents as problematic encroachers, and white residents as welcome diversity. Frame 1: where did you come from? Whiteness as novelty. Tana, who is introduced in the introduction, is an employee of a local education and economic nonprofit in her 40s. She related to me a conversation she had with her younger brother, also an Anacostia native. You know, my brother and I were at a coffee shop on Martin Luther King Avenue. It's been more than a year ago. And there were all these people coming in that were white, okay? So, like I said, when we first moved there to Anacostia's children, even though it was a changing community, I never saw the white people. But we were in there and we're having coffee, and these white people are coming in. My brother says to one of the guys, "Hey, what are you doing in here? Where did you come from?" And so the guy said, "Oh, I live up the street, and so and so and so and so." And my brother said, "Who are all these other white people that you're talking to that are coming in here?" And they belong to some kind of organization, but he said they all live in Anacostia. So my brother was like, "Wow, things are really changing." He said, "Wow, things are really changing, sis." I said, "Yeah, things are changing." Tana relates this story in answer to a general question about how the neighborhood is changing, a question which was purposely left neutral so that interviewees could comment on whatever aspects of the neighborhood's changes they considered to be most salient. While some residents talked about infrastructure changes, such as the introduction of bike share or the opening or closing of grocery stores, most of their answers to this question highlighted what the residents perceived to be the changes in the racial makeup of the community. Tana here uses constructed dialogue to portray her conversation with her brother. Constructed dialogue allows a given speaker to retell their own prior speech or the prior speech of others to describe a given incident, reanimating themselves or another along with whatever impressions they have of the speaker or the speech. By choosing exactly what to repeat, including any additions or subtractions, as well as the intonation and accompanying body language used, the narrator, Tana in this case, is adding her own interpretation about what about the dialogue matters, why it matters, and how much it matters. In giving her brother an expression of surprise when she voices him saying, "Wow, things are really changing," Tana signals the importance of the influx of white residents as a sign of that change. That Tana chooses this anecdote shows that she shares this opinion, that encountering whites in Anacostia is a remarkable turn of events. So that gives you a sense a little bit of the ways that language itself plays in with these ideas of race and racialization of the neighborhood. There are three frames that I explore. One being this frame of whiteness as novelty, one being whiteness as takeover. And so in that, you get quotes like one from one of my most elderly interviewees who compared the changes happening in the neighborhood to Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And she said, it's going to be like Things Fall Apart, where the white man came in and ruined everything. And if you know anything about that book by Achebe, it not only is about this close-knit African village. When the colonizing white Europeans come in, they destroy the village to such an extent that the narrator decides to die by suicide. And so she is saying this incredible devastation that will happen because of the white influx in her neighborhood. And then you have a third frame, which comes in the form of whiteness as diversity. And sometimes one of my more academic talks about this book is titled, I've Never Known a White Person to Live on Hill Street. And it comes from one of my participants, Dolores, who talked about the white residents that have moved in on her neighborhood. And she says, well, I ask them how they're doing, and they say they enjoying it here. And I tell them, good. All us supposed to live together. And that quote is all about reframing the ways that white residents are contributing to the diversity of the neighborhood in such a way that it can be framed as positive. And I go on and make sort of a bigger argument about that, because one of the things that happens when you are a welcoming resident to white people is that you're able to then criticize things about gentrification. So if gentrification is mostly being framed as white people coming in, even though if you remember, white people mostly were not coming in at the beginning of my research, if you talk about white people as being welcome, well, then that gives you room to oppose gentrification in particular ways without seeming like you're anti-white people. And so that also serves some really important points. So I don't know if my conversation partner has made it into the studio yet, because I can't see the backside. But yes, she has. So I want to give a really warm welcome to Minnie Annan. Minnie, I'll let you give yourself a longer introduction, just a little bit about what you're doing now. But Minnie is my colleague from Georgetown University, finishing up her doctorate there, and she is a fellow writer about the Black language of DC. She's a Georgia native, but I confused her for a Washingtonian because she really embodies Black Washington and what it means to be a part of Washington. So Minnie, thank you so much for being here tonight.
No problem. Thank you, Jesse. I apologize for being late. I was at another event honoring some young people of the district, some of the up and coming leaders, but I am honored to be here. Jesse, your work has most definitely influenced me and inspired me. So it is an honor to sit and hang out and chat a little bit about the Black side of the river with you tonight.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, I should probably introduce myself. That would be good.
Yeah, that's good.
My name is Minnie Corte Annan, but my academic name is Corte. I am from Valdosta, Georgia, South Georgia, but I've been in DC off and on for the last 21 years. And so I live and work in the community now. And I kind of fell into this project by accident, but I stayed on purpose. And so my research is looking at vowel centralization, how people say Maryland or Maryland and not Maryland, or curry out and parents. But that's a very specific thing to DC. Like there's a part of that that's, people always point to, oh, you say Maryland, it ain't Maryland, but there's actually some pride and there's some local, like you have a sense of belonging when you are saying those things. And then the other thing is I'm looking at, similar to Jessie and how she's looking at change, I'm looking at change from a different point of view. So I'm looking at the 1968 riots. I'm looking at 3 women who lived in the city and how they talk about the riots, but then the long lasting effects of the riots, and really like, had those 1968 riots not happened after the assassination of MLK, DC probably would have had a very different trajectory, especially in the lives of Black folks, because many of the areas went through a very tough economic depression for a very long time, almost 30 years. And so that's kind of where my research lies. And so I'm looking at women from all over the district and how they talk about that moment and how it's a pivotal moment in the trend, the trajectory and the history of Washington D.C.
Which is really, really interesting. And so, like, I cannot wait for this project to be done. And so the vowel centralization is so fascinating because it's so really nicely and registered in DC. And so it's funny because like you end up having to choose. This is the wonderful thing about doing research, and especially in a place as rich as DC, is you've got all of these different things that you can play with. I wound up leaving out almost all of the sound stuff from this version of this research. But I will say one of my favorite things that I got, it's actually didn't make it into the book at all, was an interview that I did with a couple who were transplants to Southeast. They really were the gentrifiers. She was Asian American and he was a Nigerian immigrant. And they had a cat whose name was Murray and Purry. After, and so we get both the invocation of the mayor and that vowel thing. And my other funny vowel story is, of course, now I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee, as all of you heard, and so I have students who are from Tennessee or from elsewhere, and I had a graduate student who's actually from Wisconsin who was doing some transcription for me, and I was reading the transcript that she had done, and I went, why did she transcribe the name of the famous wizard? And then I went back and listened, and the person said, oh, Merlin. Yeah, they're from Merlin.
Yeah.
It's like Merlin was what she wrote, which is really cool.
So Jesse, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a couple of questions kind of to really delve a little bit deeper into the book. I know you read a few passages, but kind of want to draw some issues to light and kind of get you to really sink your teeth into them. So one, DC has a lot of attitudes about Southeast. We hear them, we read them in the Washington Post, we read them in some of the local area newspapers, we hear people who come into the city talk about them. In the book, you talk about how Anacostians and other Southeast residents feel about those attitudes. So what do they do? How do they feel? What do you think those attitudes are? How are those attitudes affecting, and what are they doing? What purpose are they serving?
Yeah, so I mean, so thinking about some of the attitudes, there's a couple of really great examples that I engaged with a little bit in the book. There's one I couldn't put in the book because I couldn't get the rights to it, but there's a joke map of DC, and it labels all the neighborhoods in DC with funny things, and so like Georgetown is the metroless land of popped polo collars, right? For how people walk around Georgetown looking preppy. Woodley Park, Adams Morgan is a land of single ladies and pandas, right? So it's supposed to have like this whole ethos of, oh, this is funny. This is us making fun of these various areas of the city. The entire east side of the river is just labeled zone of perceived danger. And it just really hammers home, like, that's the joke that people find acceptable to make about Southeast DC, and especially about Southeast DC east of the river. And like, that's supposed to be funny. And so you see these sorts of linguists call them discourses, these big stories about what this neighborhood is about. So if you're from east of the river and you've grown up and you have experiences that other people are not experiencing, you automatically start to counter some of those ways that people are talking. And you do it even if, so as an interviewer, and many you know this, that we're always trying to make sure that we don't affect the kinds of things that people say or lead them in a particular direction. And so I was never asking, oh, how do you feel about the way that people talk about this neighborhood? Or very rarely, only if the conversation really went that direction. But what I would find instead is I would just ask a question about, tell me about the history. Tell me about what it was like to grow up here. and you automatically get these counter stories that undo all of the things that other people have to say. So, for example, Southeast, it's really dirty. Nobody wants to go there because everything's broken down, and we're supposed to, that's the sort of the narrative that the city wants to tell, to give reasons for why they need to come in and build things up. Instead, you automatically get from an interview, well, gosh, when I grew up here, it was really rural. There were trees, and people had chickens in their yard, and people had rabbits, and so you get these discourses instead of it's beautiful, right? The bigger discourse from outside the area. Everybody there's poor. It's a place where there's extreme poverty, and I want to point out that that's not untrue. There's still a lot of really important work to be done east of the river, and east of the river remains the highest concentration of poverty in DC, and there's a lot that needs to be done. But that's not all of east of the
Right.
river. And that's not all it has historically been. And so you automatically get people saying, when I grew up, we were between an engineer and a doctor. And when I grew up, all the fathers were here. When I grew up, people were looking out for each other. It was safe. It was almost idyllic. And all of those are direct quotes from my interviewees, most of which are in the book. And so you just see this automatic counter that anticipates these criticisms and just kind of says, nope, I'm not even going to give you room. Whoever it is that's thinking these things, I'm just not going to let you think them.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, because I think one of the things that we talk about this change, right? So there's this contrast. So you have this kind of beautiful, idyllic, back in the day kind of thing, and then you have this kind of now, right? And where people have these perceptions. There's some truth in some of there's some reality. Some of those truths are some of those realities are true, and then some of them are just perceived realities. But let's talk about I want to switch it a little bit and kind of talk about where do you think that change came from. So let's think about gentrification, because there's a lot of, when we think about the pure connotation of gentrification, I'm sorry, the pure denotation, right? Just the meaning of gentrification versus the racial connotation that has now been placed on it. So let's think about gentrification for a minute. It's a problem. And it seems like it's just going to keep coming, right? So it's not gonna go away tomorrow because, everything has changed and we're all better and we figured it all out. What are some of the changes you think are going to happen in the neighborhood next, based on kind of what you've seen over the last decade, 2 decades? And what's your hope for how the book will help you with that, or help with that?
Yeah, so it's a tough question to answer. I mean, so there are things that are happening right now, and one thing I love about the things that are happening right now is they're still very neighborhood led and neighborhood driven.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I was not paying attention to what was going on in DC in the last couple of months, but I was just visiting last week, and Minnie, you and I had some time to be together at Busboys and Poets and down in Anacostia. And that was when I learned that Navy Yard has been re-annexed as part of Ward 8. And so that's going to have some really interesting economic impacts, because one of the problems that east of the river has faced is that there's the direct quote from more than one of my interviewees was, there's no place to spend our money over here. And when there's no place to spend our money, the neighborhood can't grow. Well, now there's places to spend your money in what is Ward 8. But at the same time, it's on the other side of the river. So who's going to spend their money on one side of the river, and what's going to happen on the other? At the same time, different things have popped up over the course of my research that suggest that there's going to be real neighborhood-led growth. My favorite example of that is the Anacostia Art Center, which is a neighborhood-driven sort of conglomeration. They've got a brunch place, they've got several little art studios, they have lots of community events that happen there. And so there's this real investment in it continuing to be in Black DC and in Black Anacostia and in keeping things the way that they are. Another really interesting thing, thinking of your work, is the effects, or rather the lack of the effects of the riots. And so the 1968 riots just leveled some parts of the city. And so, pretty much all of the Green Line in Northwest, sort of starting from Mount Vernon Square up that direction, Columbia Heights, 14th Street, cutting back across toward 11th Street and Georgia Avenue. All of those places, you just had Black businesses burned to the ground, and then the remaining Black businesses not able to stay open, right? I talk a little bit in one section about that very famous incident of Barack Obama at Ben's Chili Bowl. But one of the things that I point out about Ben's Chili Bowl, so this is a very cool section. We can talk about it with audience Q&A if anyone wants a reminder of that situation. But one of the things I pointed out about Ben's Chili Bowl is it's one of the few places that has really survived all the stuff that has happened to U Street. And so you have those areas, and then like 8th Street Northeast, also big impacts of the riots, and one of the fastest places I guess I'm not getting to that point, which is that those places were really fast to gentrify as a result, because they went through all of these decades of nothing being there, and then the moment the metro opened, within 10 years you had just massive influx of people. And historic Anacostia had, as far as I heard from my interviewees, I confess I've not been able to verify this with archival data, but most people remember at max 2 places getting burned in like a copycat burning. And they thought, oh, these are just people who are trying to start the same things on this side of the river, like trying to do this same thing. But it was not a big was not hugely affected by the riots. And what that meant was change has happened much more slowly. And even into the 2020s, the same sorts of things that happened in your Columbia Heights and in your Petworth are still not happening. And that gives us an opportunity to intervene in interesting ways. And so one of the things I really hope happens as a result of my book is that I'm giving people some ways to listen and some ways to think about, okay, how do Black people talk about their space? What does it mean for a Black community to talk about their community as being a Black community? And pointing out that those things are really subtle. And so they're not necessarily the things you might think. They're these things of like, okay, we are talking about white people as encroachers and white people as welcome. But white people as welcome does really important work when it comes to talking about, well, I'm going to criticize gentrification without criticizing every white person in DC. And you might not hear that the first time you listen to someone saying something like that. So what I hope my book gives people an opportunity to think about is, how do we allow Black DC to have agency over the things that continue to happen to Black DC in this time when the population has shifted so dramatically. And I pointed out in a couple, I will point out now, because I don't remember if I pointed that out in the book, that my research for this project spanned the time in which DC became plurality Black instead of majority Black. And so the census estimates are that was sometime between 2015 and 2016, where DC dropped just below 50%, and with the other 51% being made up of several different racial groups. So there, it's still a Black plurality, but it's no longer a Black majority. And that has significant outcomes for a city that we've called the original chocolate city.
No, I think that's a really, I'm excited. I want to see the new census and really how,
right?
And I don't know, I'm kind of hesitant, right, to kind of put a lot of stock into it because of COVID and because of everything that was going on. So But anyway, I think looking like what you just said, the plurality, kind of midway through the 2010s in that decade, and really looking at how the city changed, and that drop, it wasn't a drastic drop, but that subtle drop, and that becoming a plurality and not majority really did shift in how people thought about the city more largely. Of course, like individually, I think but there's a shift, kind of the majority, and um, I think that that's something that still there's some work to explore. Like, what does that mean? So one of the things you talk about is this idea of belonging. So who gets to be the one who belongs? Like, what does it mean to belong? Who gets to determine who has access to belong? And so I'm super I'm excited to kind of think about how our research intersects, but also at what points does it diverge, because it asks different questions, and it looks at different groups. And so I don't know how much time we want to leave for questions. If you want to kind of give us a sum up, and then we reach out to some questions, because there are some. I'm pretty sure you brought up some really great points that I think we can really delve into and sink our teeth into. So I know there's a few last words that you really like to kind of put the bow on for us. So
Yeah, I mean, so that last question is really perfect, right? So we're thinking about how do we protect Black DC, and how do we keep DC with the character that DC has had for so long, because of it being this place of Black success and this place of Black growth. At the very beginning of the book, the introduction chapter is called DC and the Black Imagination. And I quote from Mr. Moore. I actually had an opportunity this past Friday when I was in DC to actually give Mr. Moore a copy of the book, and he was so excited, and really broke my heart. He was talking about how people always come and interview their senior group, and they've been a part of different studies about health initiatives and things like that, and nobody ever brings them the research back. So first of all, us researchers, we need to make sure that that we are doing right by our communities, and doing things that are useful and helpful. But he talked about DC, as a North Carolinian, that he was told about the incredible Black success in DC and all these amazing things that he could experience if he just moved to DC. And he says, I thought the streets would be paved with gold, for Black people. And so there's a real urgency in hanging on to that aspect of DC, and making sure that DC continues to be a place where Black success is nurtured, where Black culture is nurtured, where Black place is nurtured. And so the book ends with the line, we have to listen to the Black side of the river. And that's what I really hope for it, is that people learn how to listen to the experience of Black people in Black placemaking, so that we can protect all the things that make DC great. So, um, so yeah, that's a good place to end talking. And I've already seen some questions in the chat, but I want to welcome all of you in the audience. Anything that you've been thinking about language, about DC, clarifications that you would like, we would be absolutely thrilled to answer them. And we have one right off the top from Dizzy Bird. For anyone, can you speak on the ways that language might be used as protection? And it was followed on with, that's a good question, language as protection. I love that Washingtonians are hanging on to their native tongue, can't be stripped of it. And so, I mean, I can start off with some things about it. So one of the things that I discovered in my work, and this is probably the most technical part of this book. So I'm really proud. This is an academic book. Not gonna misrepresent it too far. This is considered an academic monograph, and so parts of it, it got me tenure. It's done its job, but I tried to write it in a way that that everyone could read it, because I'm not going to write a book about a neighborhood of the city that's been maligned, and where people need the research, to be going out and doing things. I'm not going to write something that only a few people with a bunch of linguistic training can read. But the most technical part of the book is a chapter that talks about the actual features of the variety that linguists call African American English. You might have heard the term Ebonics. Lately, linguists are starting to move even more toward African American language to get into the point that it's not just whether you say "did nobody do nothing" or things like that, but it also includes entire intonational patterns and all sorts of ways that we do all of the language structure. And so I look really carefully at some of those grammatical features, things like "did nobody do nothing," or things like "ain't," things like "I done did that." And what I find is I look at, okay, how often do people use this language in the different things they're talking about? And so one of the things that I found was that when people were talking about Washington, when people were talking about Southeast, people were talking about language, uh, there was just this subtle uptick in how much of these grammatical features were going to be used. And the way that I describe that is like, okay, when people are talking about race, it makes sense. Talking about race, I'm going to be a little blacker than I might be when I'm talking about other things. But interestingly, when you talk about Southeast DC, you're going to be a little blacker than you might be when you're talking about other things. And so it's a way of connecting and racializing and protecting these places. And conversely, in places where you might expect, unfortunately, due to all sorts of processes that I'm currently teaching my American Englishes class about linguistic discrimination, a lot of people are asked to leave their language at home when they go to work or school. And so when people talk about going to work or school, they leave their language at home, unfortunately. And so you see those numbers go down. And so, yeah, definitely, language being protection, language reinstantiating those Black DC identities.
And Jesse, I'll just add one other thing. I think what's really interesting is as we talk about when I'm talking about race or when I'm talking about Southeast, right? This idea, this notion of a Black identity, Southeast equals a Black identity. I think also when people go away, right? So when they're in another place, they hold stake to what DC is. So there's a different level of like one of the ladies that I was interviewing, I was talking about go-go music, and she's very just kind of, if it's on, I'll listen, but I don't go seek it out. But she's very clear when she travels, and people like she was in Chicago and they're talking about house music. She's like, oh no, I'm from DC. We have go-go, right? There's a sense of pride, like this identity, like belonging to this community. So something when you're at home, you don't really value it, but when you go out, you want to make sure that people understand where you're from. And really how she talks about go-go music, right? She's very DC, like she brings up these DC features. So I think as much as we're talking about protection, I think it's about protection, but it's also about making sure people understand there's a sense of identity that comes along with this city. So even though it's no longer chocolate city in the sense of the definition of a chocolate city, there's still so many elements, and that feeling doesn't just go away overnight because because we're the plurality and not the majority. There are people who are protecting that and keeping that alive. And I think that's what we start to see in things when people talk about mumbo sauce or people talk about go-go music, or people talk about hanging out in the city and Don't Mute DC and Marion Barry. Like they talk about these iconic DC things in a way that if they were in their living rooms, they'd be pissed off at Marion Barry. They were like, I don't eat mumbo sauce. But as soon as they get out in a public space, because that is something that they can hold on to, they most definitely embrace that in a very kind of different way. And I think that's where, so it's not just about language that we're protecting. There's a culture and identity and a sense of belonging that we're protecting as well.
Yeah, and in the chat was a question about DC Natives Day, or comment about DC Natives Day. That started a few years ago and hasn't happened in the last 2 years. So I confess, I've not been living in DC full time for the last 7 years, in fact, which just seems strange. I'm almost living in Tennessee longer than I lived in DC, which makes me sad. But I usually get back prior to COVID. I usually got back for at least a couple months a year. And the comment I'll add to that, having therefore not having any experience with DC Natives Day, but one of the things that's really fantastic and amazing about DC is that you really have generation upon generation upon generation of Black residents who have been there. And so, I had more than one interviewee who had a great or great great ancestor who was enslaved on the land that that was seized in the Reconstruction era, that became Hillsdale, that eventually became Berry Farm. And they're like literally on this land that their ancestor worked enslaved. And that's an amazing thing to have, also in a like adjacent to this giant metropolitan area, right? And so you have this super long history that I think trickles down uh, into other natives and trickles down into people who are just in DC. So another question from Anna, did I interview new residents, Black residents that have been in the neighborhoods for under 10 years? If so, how did they talk about gentrification? I had a handful of folks, although of course now they've been there for more than 10 years, because I think my latest interview was 2017 or so. It takes a long time to write a book. Um, and even longer if you submit it in 2018 and one of your reviewers says, you really haven't hit the mark with this. I think you should rewrite the whole thing. And as painful as that was to hear, they were right. And the book is such a better book for basically taking it back. One of my writing group buddies said, sometimes you have a manuscript and you just need to run it through the typewriter again. And that's exactly what I did, and came out with an organization and it came out with a book that I think is much more readable and much more about DC and about the people from it. But so I had a couple of interviewees who had been in DC for 3, 4, 5 years. So at the beginning of the excerpt that I read, I talked about Tracy, who was an ANC commissioner, and she was I believe, North Carolinian who had moved within the last 10 years. And so a couple things that you see. One, there's an almost complete overlap between newcomers and younger and middle class residents. And so those were two things that I was also interested in, was kind of what's the split between the ways that older and younger people talk about the neighborhood, what's the split between the way that people who have more working class professions or who have more middle class professions or aspirations talk about the neighborhood. And so sometimes they felt like they had a little less license to criticize what was happening. And so you would get this sense of, ooh, like, we don't love the way that the neighborhood is changing. We don't love these gentrification forces that we see happening all over the city. But we recognize that we're probably part of that. So we're going to be careful how we talk about it. That's another place where this specific grammatical use comes into play, and where you kind of see, okay, like, the grammatical features pop up when we talk about gentrification. Why? And especially for that population. Why? Because it's a way of kind of really subtly saying, oh, I mean, I really don't like this, but I recognize that other people might consider me to be a part of this. You do find, though, that people claim this area really quickly, and they claim it as Black space really quickly. And so one aspect of the book that got completely taken out, so academic books go through reviews and edits and all sorts of things, and well, all books do. And you very often get feedback where someone says, this whole section is just not working. I need you to remove it. And so I did. Someday I'll write a whole article about it. But I interviewed these two couples. I believe I named them Anna and Kevin, and so I want to make sure I don't actually say their real names. And so, so I interviewed Anna and Kevin. Anna is an Asian American woman who moved to DC from, I believe, the Bay Area, and Kevin is an immigrant from Nigeria who had lived in DC. And the really interesting thing, and the reason why one of my reviewers said, "Take this out. This is boring. It's repetitive," was because they said the same things. And so they had instantly taken claim for taken claim of the neighborhood and had taken all of these ways of talking about, no, it's really beautiful. And when my friends come over the river, like they're not willing to come over the river, and then we convince them to come over the river, and they come over the river, and we drive them up the hill to Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic Church, which has one of the most amazing vistas in all of DC. We take them up to OLPH and we look over the vista. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is so beautiful over here." And so that was really fascinating and cool, is that you hear the same things from the newcomers as you do from the people who've been there for generations. And that says something about the claim staking that's happening. Southeast has the best views, indeed. Like, it's just absolutely. And if I'd really thought this through, although I think it would be difficult, I never want to risk additional tech craziness in a talk. But I'll revoice one of my participants, Gus, who is a longtime member of Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church, one of my older interviewees. And he just went, "You look up here. You look up. There's the church. You look up here. It's beautiful up here. You look up here. You see beauty." And so those same discourses happen whether you're in your 70s and you've lived in Anacostia your whole life, or whether you're 34 and you just moved there from Petworth like 6 months ago, and that these sorts of things are in circulation about the community. And a comment from Vito. My daughter went to school next door, Washington School for Girls, right? And so, yeah, there's other things that are just being driven by the neighborhood for the neighborhood, right? And so actually, when I first started this research, Washington School for Girls was just starting at that campus. And so the Catholic Church used to have a Catholic school attached to it, and so they had a school building, and then over the years lost funding for the school. This has happened to many parochial and diocesan schools over the years, but especially to the ones that were historically Black. And so one of the interviewees for the book, for research purposes and the kinds of things we have to do as academics, which I consider to sometimes be somewhat silly because they wind up obscuring the important things for the people in the book. But the headmaster of the Washington School for Girls is in fact one of the interviewees in the book, and so she's got a couple of quotes in there. So, and Minnie, I don't know if you have any commentary about.
No, so I'm thinking about the Washington School for Girls at the art campus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I work for Boys and Girls Club, so obviously we have, so I'm very familiar. We have a partnership with the ARC and of course with Washington School for Girls. So many of the girls actually come down to the club and spend time. And now we have, I think it's Bishop Walker there. Also, the boys' campus, they walk over and they are part of the club as well. And I think interestingly, I was here when that opened, but I wasn't connected in the same way. So I've kind of watched it, kind of partnerships succeed and some partnerships not succeed over the last decade. but I really haven't. So I kind of study all over DC, and so I haven't um, really had as much of a deep dive specifically in the neighborhood outside of the people that I know and that talk to me. And so because my focus is more largely on oh yes. Okay, I see that. Awesome. Sorry. So because my focus is more largely on DC, I center a lot of my questions and my thoughts on how the city has changed as opposed to one specific neighborhood. Ask people to talk about their neighborhoods, but then ultimately that leads to a commentary on the larger, like how my neighborhood fits into the city or how it doesn't, right? So I think in that sense, I've watched that space swell and shrink, right? To kind of welcome in as much, but also kind of push out because there are partners in that space that could benefit the residents of that community that for financial reasons or whatever they may be aren't welcomed in that space anymore. So as much as there's access, there's also kind of a gatekeeping when you kind of hold the power and you hold the real estate. I mean, I have seen that happen in various ways. And when you have these kind of large partnership conglomerates, for the lack of a better word, when you kind of have all these partners coexisting in a space, at some point power becomes a part of it. And you see that at play. And so sometimes the people who those services are meant to serve actually become victimized, and they become hurt in that case because you have these people at the top playing. It's a little farther away from language, but the power dynamics actually are really interesting to watch people talk about, kind of how there's things that the community served and did for them, but now they don't have access to that same kind of service. And so it's interesting, or maybe they do, but they don't perceive that it's available to them anymore. And so it's really interesting to hear people talk about what it used to be versus what it is now. And that's where I get a lot of that from from my participants.
Fantastic. I don't want to run us too far over the hour, but I think there's another important question in the chat that Minnie, I think you and I can both speak to, which is about these questions of sort of research ethics. So from
Mm-hmm.
Anna, did you get any pushback from residents tired of being interviewed and studied? What were some of your resources, meaning as in prior research before approaching residents? And so we can each talk about this because, yeah, this is a big concern. Right. And this is one of the things that researchers tend to do badly, which is to pop into a community, especially a community like east of the river, where lots of people have been popping in and out to go, oh, okay, we want to see how many children have type 1 diabetes. Great. We're going to take a bunch of research and then maybe we do something to help you with
Exactly.
this situation or not. And so I will say that I didn't receive a lot of pushback from people because the nature of sociolinguistic research is wonderful, because the thing you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to give you lots and lots and lots and lots of language exactly the way that they would normally produce it. And so a sociolinguistic interview is, when done right, they are extremely messy, and you interview people and you just kind of let things go exactly wherever your interviewee wants to take them. And you just let the conversation unfold. And so for lots of people, it was really an opportunity. Like once they let me in the door, to go, oh, okay, I get to talk about my history for 2.5 hours and tell you about all the things that exist in the neighborhood. And so usually after I talk to one person, they would say, "Oh, okay, got my auntie. You got to
Yeah.
talk to my auntie." And then the auntie, they email the auntie, "Oh yeah, she told me it was wonderful talking to you. So come by anytime," and so on. But in terms of resources, you got to know what you're talking about. And so this work for this book was accompanied by lots and lots of archival research, digging in the deep boxes with the DC Public Library, looking at things like community council notes and like minutes from community council meetings from the 1950s, looking at how tax law has changed and property taxes have changed throughout the 70s and 80s that led to the kind of white flight and black flight that created PG County and that created things in Southeast DC. And then, of course, your interviewees give you things as you're going. So, I was not immediately aware as a fourth year graduate student of, say, the history of the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum. And so my interviewee said, "Oh, no, no, that used to be down on, well, it used to be called Nichols Boulevard. So it was on Nichols was where it was." And so then you go in and go, okay, well, I'm going to find out all of the history here and read all of the documents and really understand how that relationship developed. How did Fort Stanton develop? What's the role of this church that's here? What's the role of the museum that's around the corner? And how are they connected to all of this development in urban? And I hate to say urban change. Urban change is often a different name for gentrification, and I'm not talking about gentrification. I'm talking about the ways that the neighborhood itself has shaped itself over the generations. So, Minnie, I don't know if you've found very similar things in your work.
Yeah, I don't think, so because I live, well, not anymore. I don't live in the district. I live right outside in Prince George's County. But I do work in DC. And so a lot of it, when I was doing this research, it kind of happened on accident, right? I interviewed one person, and then I was at work. And when you work in the city, right, you develop relationships. And so people, were very receptive to me coming in. Like one of my interviews we had, she cooked breakfast, like she made it a whole thing. And then I interviewed her boyfriend and he was nervous. So we had to take shots. We took shots before the interview, right? But and as Jesse said, the interview, if you do a sociolinguistic interview right, it's very messy. And so a lot of the interviews that I've done, they're now part of this publicly accessible corpus that you can go and listen to. But a lot of it was really these people welcoming me into their home. So we would be having a glass of wine or they would cook dinner. And I think a lot of that is, so I didn't get pushback in that way because I wasn't going to groups that were, so like the older gentleman said, we've had a lot of people who come to study our group. I was just going to people that I knew. And so they didn't see as much as a, dang, we just did this last week for the other girl. Can't you talk to her? Like we just did this last month for that other group, ain't nobody said nothing to us. And so actually I've played back, I'll tell you two quick stories. I played back, as I was telling you, I'm interviewing these older women. And so I have one older woman and I was at her house, like this is several years. I was at her house a few weeks ago, but I interviewed her like 5-6 years ago. And I was telling her I'm writing about her in this chapter and I let her hear her passage and she started to cry because it brought so many memories. Like she was like, wow, thank you for honoring my words, but thank you for letting me hear my words. And then the other one, I interviewed her in the summer and then she passed away that next. So I interviewed her in July and she passed away the next spring. The next January. And it's, we became friends because I would work late because I had to go to school in the morning. So I would in my work day later and she was the custodian. And so we became friends because I was always sitting at my desk. And so after she'd clean up, she'd come in and talk to me and I asked her, could I interview her? And so afterwards I wanted to kind of honor who she was. And so part of my chapter is about her, but I also gave a recording to her sons because she dotes on her children, right? And so for me, I haven't had that same experience because I haven't gone to these groups that are often targeted for places of study. I've really gone into people's living rooms that oftentimes their voices are muted, right? And I know this, don't mute this. So I specifically use that word intentionally because, don't mute DC and their voices aren't the ones that you hear all the time. And I think they were so happy to take part and to put their stories and whatever their reality of DC was into something that's going to live beyond them. And clearly in the case of this older woman who passed away, it clearly is living beyond her and she's continuing to speak to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I'm starting to do with some of my recordings is to make sure that they get back to the people whom they're from. And so sometimes universities like to try and stand in the way of that, or like we have these review boards that are designed to make sure that if you're sticking people and like drawing their blood, you're following the right procedures. And sometimes they clamp down. Not sometimes, very often they clamp down a little bit too hard on those of us who are doing social research, because we're really trying to create things that give back. So I think that is a really great spot for us to end, is thinking about giving back. And I will share with all of you that honestly, my favorite page, the page that I am proudest of in the book, is right at the beginning, and it's the page of the catalog data. Because Minnie and I, we're linguists. We do this thing of studying language as the object of study. But it was really important to me to not front the discipline that I come from, and not front the techniques that I was using, or all of the academic stuff. And so one of the things that I was hopeful for this book, you don't get to decide where it sits in the Library of Congress. The librarians decide which books it's most like and where it should sit in the Library of Congress. And my book got classified not with P, not with PE, with the English books, or P with the linguistics books more broadly, but with F202, which is Washington, D.C. history. And that's what this is all about. It's about telling the story of D.C.
What a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much to both of you for being here and for this wonderful discussion. Thank you to the audience for joining us and for your wonderful questions. And as a transplant to DC, I just want to say I'm very grateful for the culture here and grateful for you documenting it in this way and the work that both of you do as linguists. So, again, thank you. And if you'd like to purchase the book, The Black Side of the River, and I know you do, you can do so by going to www.sankofa.com, or you can also stop by our brick and mortar store at 2714 Georgia Avenue Northwest and pick up a copy. Again, I'd like to say thank you, and I hope everyone has a great night, a safe night, and happy Black History Month.
Happy Black History Month. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.